Sir, there's God right in the clouds, Santa in the sky, white dude, all the biblical characters in the Bible, children's books, white people, even though they were in a part of the world where there are no white people, right? So even though we don't have that in our home, my child has nonetheless already at the age of 7 somehow internalized the idea that the creation source of the universe, whether taken in religious terms or humanistic and more naturalistic terms, is somehow closer to her than to Morgan Freeman. And if my daughter has internalized that, what do you think black and brown children internalize when they see the same imagery? And they see those images. They see them in the stained glass of our churches. You see them in the Christmas cards that get sent around every holiday season where baby Jesus is in the manger in what apparently is Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, rather than the other Bethlehem. Right? Lily white Jesus, which makes no sense anthropologically, biologically, historically, makes no sense at all. But our children see those images and it can affect them. Now, if you were to try to break into my house and hurt my children, I would kill you without hesitation. I don't even have a gun, but I would find something and I would throw it at you and you would die. Like, it's just that simple. I would make sure that you died, right? If you were to try to hurt my kids. I'm not saying that because I'm a badass. I'm just saying, like, I'm just letting you know, like, don't mess with my children. But the problem, right? The problem is that there is something coming into that house. And it is hurting my children, and it's hurting all of our children, and it's hurting us, and I didn't even know it was there. See, the doors are locked at night, the windows are shut, the alarm is on, and whatever this thing is doesn't know the code, but the dirty little secret is it doesn't need to. It weasels its way into our children's brains and affects them. That's how I know that we've all ingested this poison, and we better own that if we're gonna have an honest dialogue. It's not about feeling guilty about it. In fact, that's the beauty of it, right? If we've all been subjected to it, there's no reason to feel guilty.
Racism is not just about individual acts of prejudice. It is a system that has been woven into the fabrics of policies, institutions, and societal norms, disproportionately affecting Black communities. Today, we will examine how systemic racism manifests and why dismantling it is crucial. Watch and pay attention, and I will share my thought later.
Because we could not have helped but ingest it. The question is, what do we do now? How do we take responsibility, which is not the same as guilt? Responsibility is what you take because of the kind of person you are. Guilt is what you feel for the stuff you've actually done. Those are two different things. We take responsibility for things even when we're not to blame for them. So that's the first piece. The second piece, the systemic piece, right? Our inability or our lack of willingness to admit that there's also a systemic element to racism, that it's not just about personal prejudice. If it were, it'd be so much easier, right? Because we could just educate people out of their biases, right? And we could somehow undo their personal stuff and everything would be fine. But there's a bigger problem, and it's systemic. It's the way that policies and practices and everyday procedures reinforce inequality between different racial groups, even if there's no overt bigotry in the room. What do I mean by that? Let me tell you a story to make that point. And it's a story about my own life. I am from the South. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. I've lived in the South all my life, 10 years in New Orleans, the rest of it in Nashville. 5 months in Houston, but we don't talk about that. No offense to Houston, I'm just saying, like, there are reasons and we will not discuss them. So growing up in Nashville, I went to school in public schools at a time when they had really just become truly integrated. That may seem sort of hard to believe because theoretically, right, the Supreme Court outlawed segregation back in 1954, but as was the case in Nashville, so too was it the case all throughout the South, that very few school systems actually moved toward real desegregation for about 20 years. So it was 1974, the year that I started first grade, that the school system in Nashville was actually truly integrated all the way down to the first grade level. And so by 1979-80, my 5th grade year, right, there were a lot of teachers in that system that had been in there for a really long time. Like, they had been teaching since the days of segregation, and they were the kind of people that really preferred the days of segregation, right? So they didn't like having to teach Black kids now, but what they really didn't like was having to teach white kids who hung out with Black kids. And that was me. See, I told you before, most of the time when we say we have Black friends, we're lying. In my case, I pretty much didn't have anything but Black friends for the first several years of school, because I went to preschool at a historically Black college when I was 3 years old. Tennessee State University early childhood ed program. So most of my peers were Black kids. So when I got into public school, that's who I was hanging out with. That's who I played ball with. That's who I played on the playground with. That's who I sat in the cafeteria with. And there were teachers who not only didn't like the black kids, but really didn't like me, particularly because of my affinities, both culturally, linguistically, and artistically with black folks. These are the early days of hip hop. And I was that kid. Like, I was the white kid that hung out when we would have like rap battles. And I'm not going to do that shit now because it would be tragic. But in those days, like 79, 80, you could be really bad at that in Nashville and you were still the best on the block, right? Because it was Nashville, it wasn't Brooklyn, it wasn't the Bronx, right? So the teachers really had a problem with who I hung out with and the music that I listened to and who my friends were. And there was one particular teacher, Mrs. Crownover, who was most offended by it. And so one day I get a report card, I have a D- in a reading class, which was what she taught, right? And my mom freaked out because reading was like the one thing I could do, right? If it was a math class, she would have totally not even blinked. She'd have been like, well, at least you didn't fail. You know? Good for you. You got it up from the F last time, you know? But in this particular case, I'd been reading since I was like 2.5, right? So she sort of freaks out. She schedules a parent-teacher conference. She goes to talk to Miss Crownover. And within about 30, 45 seconds, she realizes that grade had nothing to do with my actual effort, let alone my attitude, let alone my ability to read. It had to do with my social circle because Miss Crownover looks at my mom within the first minute of the meeting and says, any white parent that would send their kids to public school in this day and age, meaning an integrated day and age, obviously isn't fit to be a parent. They've lost their mind. This, by the way, is not what you want to say to my mother. So within a day or two, she organized with some other parents, and within 2 or 3 or 4 days, she had very directly and unceremoniously made sure that Mrs. Crownover was relieved of her income and her professional duties from there on out. She was forced into early retirement, as she should have been. So good for my mom. On the one hand, that's great. We got rid of the bigot. But remember, I told you it wasn't about individual bigots. It was about systems. And so here's the problem. Even as my mother took action, as she should have, to remove this racist from the classroom where she had no business teaching, right? But the problem was that after Miss Crownover was gone, I went back into a school system that every day, in a very subtle but pernicious way, was sending the same kind of message that Mrs. Crownover was trying to send, which is white students are better, black students are lesser, and they shouldn't be together. How was the system sending that message? Very easy. By putting almost all the white kids in the honors and the advanced level classes, no matter what kind of students we were. I was a lousy student. I wasn't a good student till like last week. I literally got my shit together like Tuesday of last week, right? I wasn't a good student, but I was always in the honors track. And the black kids, no matter how bright they were almost always in the standard or the remedial level track and never moved up no matter how well they did. So the system was sending a message by dividing us and saying that it was division based on ability, but it wasn't. They were sending the message that Crownover was sending. They didn't even need her there to send it, you see, and my mother never saw that. And I never saw that. It went right over our heads. And that's not just a 1979 story. That continues to happen today. Right now in this country, students of color are half as likely to be placed in advanced placement and honors classes compared to white students. Students of color are half as likely to be taught by the most experienced teachers. White students twice as likely to have the most experienced teachers. Right? Black and Latino students 2, 3, even 4 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, even though they do not break the rules more often than white students. That's the belief, but it's not true. There have been 14 different studies. They all find the same thing, that the rates of serious school rule infractions are virtually identical across racial lines. People bringing drugs to campus, equally across racial lines. People bringing weapons to campus, actually white men more likely to bring guns and knives to campus in K-12 schools than black men or Latino men. Contrary to popular belief, but that's what the Centers for Disease Control research says. But who is it that's getting caught? It's black kids and Latino kids. They're the ones getting searched. They're the ones getting detected. They're the ones getting suspended and often prosecuted. Whereas white students are doing the same thing, doing drugs just as much, bringing weapons just as often, if not more so, and escaping notice. So that's still happening. That's a system, and it doesn't require one overt racist in the classroom for that to continue, right? So that becomes a problem. We have to do more than just look at the individual. We have to look at the way that structures operate, sometimes without us even realizing it's happening. Because if we don't do that, we can get rid of every individual bigoted cop or every individual bigoted teacher or any individual bigoted employer. We can sue them, I guess, in court. And maybe people can even win those lawsuits, but what does that really change unless we take aim at those institutional policies that keep recreating inequality? The third piece, our unwillingness to see how history affects the present, how the past and the present mix. We really don't like this. We really don't want to talk about this. And when I say we, I mean those of us called white especially. There are people of color who don't necessarily always want to engage it either, but especially those of us called white. We'll say things like this when people of color bring up racism. We'll say, well, why can't you just get over it? You know, all of that slavery stuff was a long time ago. In fact, Louis C.K. has this really funny bit, right, where he jokes about how white people have just moved the date of slavery further and further and further back. Like it used to be, slavery was 100 years ago, because it was. And then it was, slavery was 125 years ago, because it was. And now it should be, slavery was 150 years ago. But we'll actually say things like, that was hundreds and hundreds, that was like 1,000 years ago, where we've had slavery for 500 years. When in fact, it's very much within the lifetime of people in this room's great-great-grandparents, even sometimes great-grandparents. And in fact, de facto slavery extended well past the Emancipation Proclamation. There were people of color being sent back into virtual enslavement all throughout the first 30 years of the 20th century, being made to work in the mines in places like Birmingham, coal mines there and elsewhere, going back to the very plantations from which their grandparents and great-grandparents had been emancipated, as sharecroppers, as tenant labor, tenant farmers, right? So in fact, slavery isn't that long ago. Segregation certainly isn't that long ago. But here's the point. We don't want to talk about it. And this is really funny that we want to tell black and brown folks to get over the past, because frankly, those of us who are white, we love the past. Absolutely flippin' love the past. How do I know that? Because some of us clearly want to go back to it. How do I know that? Because the Tea Party was a thing. And during that period when the Tea Party was a thing, you had a bunch of white folks go into rallies dressed in Revolutionary War costumes, carrying muskets and wearing powdered wigs. Okay, here's the thing. If you dress up in a Revolutionary War costume with a musket and a powdered wig, calling yourself the Tea Party, which I think is a really old-ass reference, you are in no position to lecture black people about getting over the past. That's all, right? Because by definition, you're still rocking like 1774. You got me? Right? But even now, right, we say things like, what is July 4th other than a reference to the past? Like, why do we still celebrate that? Independence Day. We broke away from the British a long ass time ago. That didn't happen last Friday. So why do we still set off fireworks every July 4th, right? I dare you to go up next Independence Day to like the most patriotic guy on the route, you know, with the red, white, and blue wardrobe, because that's an awesome wardrobe palette, and like a big I Heart the USA button on his hat, like flying a flag, blaring Lee Greenwood from the back of a pickup truck. I dare you to go up to that guy, tap him on the shoulder and say, yeah, this is all really nice, this is great, but when are you gonna get over it? Hope you have running shoes on, because he's gonna chase you. Although he'll probably have had enough, you know, slices of mom's apple pie that he won't be able to catch you. But my point being, we love the past as long as it makes us feel good about ourselves, right? When a current presidential candidate says he wants to make America great again, it's a reference to the past, right? It's a reference that says we want to go back to when things were great, but only great for certain people, because the time that's being remembered so fondly wasn't so great for everyone. Right? So we love the past as long as it venerates us. We just don't want to deal with the ugly, but that's not how history works. You got to deal with the good and the bad and everything in between, right? And we know that, don't we? Like on a personal level, we know, like, put aside politics and race, just like you as individuals, right? We all come from families that are jacked up in one way or another, right? We all have dysfunction. We all have really messed up stuff in our families, some of which we talk about, a lot of which we never talk about, right? And the fact is, if you ever want, just as an individual, to move past your past, you have to confront it. Whether that's on a therapist's couch or whether that's with friends or a lover or a spouse or a partner, whatever it is, you've got to be willing to confront where you come from in order to get to the next place that's better. But we don't want to do that. We don't do that as individuals, and it eats us up. And we don't do that as a country, but we have to do that. Because the past affects the present. Inertia isn't just a property of the physical universe. It's also a property of the political and the economic universe. And here's how I know it's so important. Again, a story involving my own children about why it's so important that we know our history and are able to articulate that, and the dangers of not knowing it. So as it turns out, our daughters are both dancers.
Systemic racism refers to the ways in which policies and practices within institutions create and maintain racial inequality. It is not about what people do, but about how systems are designed to privilege one group over another. Systemic racism has created a vast economic divide. Black families, on average, have significantly less wealth than white families, a disparity rooted in discriminatory practices like redlining, unequal wages, and limited access to financial resources. Education is often touted as the key to success. Yet, systemic racism ensures that black children face significant barriers. Schools in predominantly black neighborhoods are often underfunded and lack resources, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and limited opportunity. One of the starkest examples of systemic racism is found in the criminal justice system. Black people are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and sentenced to long prison terms than their white counterparts for the same crimes they committed. Housing discrimination did not end with the civil rights movement. Today, black families are still more likely to live in segregated neighborhoods with fewer resources, poor infrastructure, and greater exposure to environmental hazards. Breaking the cycle of systemic racism requires collective action. It starts with acknowledging the problem and advocating for policies that address the disparities at their root. Systemic racism is not an insurmountable problem. It is a challenge we must all face together. Through education, advocacy, and action, we can build a society where opportunities and justice are truly equal for everyone. How do you think we can tackle systemic racism? Share your ideas in the comment below. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.